Ladies and gentlemen, the President and Vice President of the United States, accompanied by Hillary Rodham Clinton and Tipper Gore, Princess Margaret of the Netherlands, Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial Commission co-chairs, Senator Mark Hatfield and Senator Daniel Inouye, and Mr. David B. Roosevelt. Please welcome the Master of Ceremonies, Mr. Mike Wallace.
It's apparent that God smiled this morning. This sun, I am told, this is the best day that Washington has had in months. And if you'd been here yesterday and saw what was going on, it looked as though this whole apparatus was going to be blown into the basin. We're all going to remain standing for the presentation of the colors.
Please remain standing for the singing of our national anthem, led by Miss Denise Graves of the Metropolitan Opera, followed by the Invocation and the retirement of the colors.
Oh,
the Very Reverend Nathan D. Baxter, Dean of Washington National Cathedral, will deliver the invocation.
Let us pray. O God of the ages, inspirer of nations and author of liberty, we praise you for this nation you have called forth from many races, peoples, and tongues, and for your guiding hand which continually seeks to make out of many one. We thank you for giving us faithful and courageous leaders through whom you have directed us in times of prosperity and sustained us in times of despair. We especially thank you on this day for Franklin Delano Roosevelt, who guided us in times of war, depression, and social inequity. By your grace, he led us with a passion for national renewal and the well-being of every citizen. We thank you that in our dark hour of national life, he was a leader of frankness and vigor, reminding us that the only thing we had to fear was fear itself. He helped inspire us that we could turn retreat into advance, and by your grace we did. We thank you for this leader who was born to privilege but formed to serve, who was greatly disabled in body but more greatly abled in leadership. We thank you for this President of the people. And so, O Lord, today we consecrate these structures of his remembrance. May we and future generations be always inspired by his example, and being so inspired, grant that we, the people, and the leaders of our generation may submit to thy guiding hand, becoming one nation under God, indivisible, with liberty and justice for all. Amen.
Once again, Mr. Mike Wallace.
Are we not going to have the retirement of the colors before I continue? You can sit down for what we hope will be a moving ceremony, and wait until you see what is behind us here. It is such a stunning commemoration of Franklin Roosevelt. An appreciative and warm welcome to the President and to Mrs. Clinton, as well as to Vice President and Mrs. Gore, Princess Margaret of the Netherlands, our honored guests, to the thousands of you who are here at the memorial, and to the millions who are watching this morning on television. We look back today at the life and the accomplishments of an extraordinary man, a man elected 4 times to the presidency, who led this country through the bitter years of a major depression and through a world war to the threshold of victory. The story goes that Franklin Roosevelt told Justice Felix Frankfurter that he was not interested in a memorial any bigger than the size of his desk. And for half a century, that is just what he got. In fact, that small memorial sits right now in front of our National Archives. So for the past half century, FDR became almost a non-presence here in Washington. Tourists who came to the nation's capital could contemplate the drama of the Washington Monument and the Jefferson Memorial and the Lincoln Memorial, but virtually nothing for FDR. Until finally, a couple of senators, one Republican, one Democrat, decided to do something about it. Mark Hatfield and Daniel Inouye. Without their resolve, all of us would not be gathered here this morning. The Roosevelt years began on March 4th, 1933. It was a dismal, sullen day that matched the mood of the people here in Washington who had gathered for his inaugural. Because of the paralyzing depression, many Americans had lost faith in their government and, to some degree, in themselves. FDR took hold. He led us out of that despond and then through a world war to the eve of victory. And he accomplished that heroic chore with 10 pounds of steel attached to his legs. For my own parents, both of them immigrants from Russia at the turn of the century, and in our Brookline, Massachusetts home, Franklin Roosevelt was a hero of mythic proportions. We children were made to feel that this extraordinary man in the White House cared about us, that there was a connection between him and us. Those Depression years were tough on all Americans who lived through them, but somehow we shared a feeling that FDR was going to guide us safely through. My NYA job, National Youth Administration job at the University of Michigan back in the late 30s, grading exam papers for a journalism professor, paid me 30 absolutely vital dollars each month for a year or two. And I somehow came to believe that FDR was responsible for that. I never met him. I never saw him up close. But I did know Eleanor Roosevelt a little back in the 50s, and when I interviewed her in 1957, I asked if she did not agree, unhappily, that a good many people hated her husband. "Oh, yes," she said. "A great many do still." There was a real core of hatred. The people who used to call him that man in the White House. When FDR died, I still remember vividly Arthur Godfrey's tearful radio description of the procession that led the caisson bearing the president's body through the streets of Washington, and the newsreels that showed the affection and the sadness etched into the faces of everyone who lined the streets here on that day. That moment is now captured on bronze inside the memorial. It is glorious that finally we Americans have a fitting memorial to FDR here in West Potomac Park. And now, I would like to recognize one of the two men I mentioned earlier, who since the early 1970s has led the bipartisan effort to honor President Roosevelt. Please welcome Senator Mark Hatfield.
Mr. President, Mrs. Clinton, Mr. Vice President, Mrs. Gore, Your Royal Highness, Princess Margaret of the Netherlands, my fellow commissioners, members of the Park Service, the artisans, and the builders of this great memorial, distinguished guests, and all who have gathered here today to celebrate the life of Franklin Roosevelt, welcome. This memorial honors a president, his legacy, and an entire generation of Americans. The FDR Memorial has been called a work of art with an epic reach. I wish to recognize the renowned and great talented artists who have especially contributed to this memorial. First and foremost, the memorial designer, Mr. Lawrence Halprin, engaged in this project since 1974, is the man whose genius, vision, and tenacity created this magnificent tribute to our nation's 32nd president. This memorial invites visitors into the midst of its historical narrative by presenting evocative depictions and words of the FDR era, created by the following American artists: sculptor Leonard Baskin of Massachusetts, lettering artist and stone carver John Benson of Rhode Island, sculptor Neil Eston of New York, sculptor Robert Graham of California, sculptor Tom Hardy of Oregon, and sculptor George Siegel in New Jersey. I also wish to recognize members of the FDR Memorial Commission whose congressionally authorized mission to plan, design, and construct this memorial has reached its successful completion today, and much to the surprise of some of us. First and foremost, I recognize one of my dearest and longtime friends, colleague, a great American, the co-chairman, Senator Daniel K. Inouye of Hawaii. By the way, Senator Inouye and I have been serving on this commission since 1971. You know, I was a school teacher one time, and I never tolerated whispering while I was lecturing. Special recognition also goes to Senator Carl Levin, who has actively served on this commission since 1981, and really the author of Fala in the depiction of the Roosevelt period. And to David Roosevelt, who was appointed by President Bush in 1992, and other commission members are Senator Alphonse D'Amato, Representative Maurice Henshey, Representative Jerry Lewis, Representative Phil English, and presidential appointees Barbara Hanman, Lester Hyman, and Jack Teemer. I also give special recognition to the two volunteer leaders of the Memorial's capital campaign, Mr. Jack Valenti and Mrs. Anna Chenault. Today, two generations of Americans sit together to witness these ceremonies. For one, the memory of FDR is living and personal. For the other, Franklin Delano Roosevelt is but a name from history. I believe, and the Roosevelt Memorial Commission was created 42 years ago by a generation that wished to celebrate its shared experience of the FDR years. And the culmination of this commission's efforts comes in the midst of a generation that knows little of our 32nd president. But the memorial resting on this ground will link these two generations and generations to come, and it will establish a more lasting memory than which death erases. President Roosevelt was not a simple man, and not a man merely of great deeds. He was a master of great symbols. We sought to capture the symbolism in the design of this memorial. FDR was a man skilled in oratory, and we sought to preserve his words in this memorial. President Roosevelt's patrician yet warm voice reached out from the podium and over the radio to embrace his audience. We sought in the same way for this memorial to embrace the people, the visitors, and not stand apart from them. I might comment that a previous Congress determined the site of this memorial. The Commission paid particular attention to the special place reserved for this memorial. Its location amidst three national political icons: one, the father of our country; one, to the expounder of our liberties; and one, to the preserver of our union, is sacred ground. We sought to preserve its sanctity and to maintain a proper relationship with the other memorials, such as the waters of Warm Springs were therapy for the President Roosevelt's weak limbs. The waters of naval history were his avocation. Thus, water which surrounds the site and water used artistically within it are incorporated in the memorial. God blessed Franklin Roosevelt with many gifts. His sharp intellect, his skill in the art of personal relationships, his self-assurance, and the strength of character to act boldly. God gave him a talent to turn a phrase. President Roosevelt's words fill our American vocabulary. We have nothing to fear but fear itself. A day that will live in infamy. The forgotten man. The New Deal, and the Four Freedoms. Today, we complete the building of a place to honor this commanding presence which inspired us, called us forth in self-sacrifice, calmed our fears, and gave us hope for a brighter tomorrow.
Franklin Roosevelt treasured his Dutch heritage. He longed to visit the land of his ancestors as president, but that was not to be. Please welcome FDR's goddaughter, Princess Margaret of the Netherlands.
Mr. President, Mrs. Clinton, Mr. Vice President, Mrs. Gore, ladies and gentlemen. I'm honored to be here today as the goddaughter of Franklin Delano Roosevelt, the president who contributed so much to the freedom of our country. I was born during the Second World War, not in the Netherlands, but in exile. In Canada. The Roosevelt White House and the House of Orange became closely connected during those years. My grandmother, Queen Wilhelmina, my parents, my sisters, and I, as a baby, were frequent guests at Hyde Park and the White House. President Roosevelt was proud of his Dutch ancestry. When he was sworn into office, he held his hand on the Dutch family Bible. President Roosevelt died a mere 3 weeks before the Netherlands was finally liberated by the Allied forces. He knew victory was close at hand and told Mrs. Roosevelt that he wanted to travel to the Netherlands and other European countries as soon as the war had ended. Had he come, he would have received an overwhelming welcome by the people of the Netherlands. The gratitude we felt then towards the United States and President Roosevelt for the role they played in our liberation lives on. Furthermore, the biannual presentation in the Netherlands of the Four Freedoms Award keeps his memory alive and reminds us of the four freedoms he believed every individual had a right to: freedom of speech, freedom of worship, freedom from want, and freedom from fear. In the Netherlands, we express our gratitude by giving flowers. The more thankful we are, the larger the bouquet becomes. Although no bouquet can ever be large enough to express the infinite gratitude we feel towards President Roosevelt, I am delighted to present to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial a bouquet of a new rose variety, cultivated for this occasion, the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Rose. When you When you visit the memorial, you will see it at the entrance. We chose a rose because Roosevelt means a field of roses in the Dutch language. And the orange color was picked to reflect the close ties between the Roosevelts and the House of Orange. I feel privileged to be here today to share with you this historic occasion. And I'm pleased to present Mrs. Clinton and Mrs. Gore with a bouquet of Franklin Delano Roosevelt roses.
Since the 1980s, our next speaker has taken an active interest in the development of this memorial, which honors his grandfather. It was he who enlisted me in this enterprise about 10 years ago. In 1992, President George Bush appointed him to the FDR Memorial Commission. Please welcome David Roosevelt.
Thank you, Mike. Mr. President, Mrs. Clinton, Mr. Vice President, Mrs. Gore, Your Royal Highness, members of Congress and distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, before I start my prepared remarks, Mr. President, I was told I had about 3 to 4 minutes. you've heard me speak before. I am a Roosevelt, and I think you and I share something, but I will try. It was 6 years ago, on a very hot and humid day. The same airplanes were flying. But on that day, many of us gathered on this very site to celebrate the groundbreaking of the Franklin D. Roosevelt Memorial. And at that time, few of us believed that we would actually witness the transformation of what was then a flat and not particularly attractive, albeit a very busy piece of West Potomac Park, into what you will see this morning. And we gather again today for yet another celebration, a celebration of this magnificent memorial. And we gather to pay tribute, not to a man, but to an era in this nation's history. An era marked by tragedy and suffering, an era surpassed perhaps only by the Civil War in its infliction of pain and travail on the people of this nation. An era which provided for all time that this United States, united as one, could withstand any challenge. And we gather today to pay tribute to those very same people whose strength and perseverance and belief in a way of life enabled this nation to emerge triumphant over the depths of human economic suffering and the devastation of war. That is what this memorial is really all about. The fact that Franklin Delano Roosevelt just happened to be leader of the United States at that time, and under those circumstances, is only one part of the message conveyed by this magnificent creation. And I hope that as you walk through this memorial today, or on the days ahead, that you will constantly be reminded of the hopelessness and despair of those days from 1933 to 1945, and feel the qualities of a personality which gave hope and direction so a nation and its people could triumph. And we are here to thank those whose hard work for so many, many years have made this memorial a reality. Those whose names will largely go unremembered. Former members of the Memorial Commission, including the late Senator Claude Pepper, who, as chair of the commission from the mid-1980s until his death in 1990, virtually saved this memorial project. And President Ronald Reagan, whose persistent support encouraged Congress to act on the necessary and early appropriations. The National Park Service, into whose hands we now pass this memorial. The hundreds of construction workers who worked throughout the winter to ensure that this day would come and on time, and the many, many others whose behind-the-scenes efforts make this what we see today. And on behalf of my colleagues and all Americans, I thank them. And I offer a very special tribute once again to Larry Halprin, his staff, and to the collective efforts of the artists and artisans. Larry, your colleagues, give us all this day an artistic masterpiece, which creatively preserves the historical mandate which you were given. I offer you my profound thanks. This commission, unlike others, had a very, very small staff, 2. And I would like to thank the executive director, Duran Gunderson, and Colleen Carolyn, her assistant. But most importantly, a very special tribute must be made to the thousands of ordinary people whose $1 and $5 and $10 contributions were so very, very important to the completion of this memorial. Almost all of whom remember FDR, and today many of whom live on meager incomes provided by the Social Security. People who wished they could be here today with us, but who are here in our hearts. Today we commemorate them and their contributions to the strengths of this nation. And I would like to take just a few seconds to ask all members of my family, the Roosevelt family, to stand for a little recognition because they too are part of this memorial. Would you all stand, please? In the course of almost every presidential memorial, there has been a certain degree of controversy, and to be sure, this one is no exception. We as people are a very passionate people about how we portray our heroes, and rightfully so. Public debate and discourse is the most democratic of activities, and the systems established to oversee the design and approval of memorials and monuments placed on our national mall are an integral part of that democratic process. The process is at times painful, and the issues involved are complex and should not be surrendered to individual interest in keeping with our great democracy. The result of this one is one that we should all celebrate. My hope is that all who visit this memorial will accept its message in their heart. There are lessons for this nation's future generations to be found in the strengths of its past. There are lessons to be learned within these granite walls, lessons which I hope will give guidance to our future and to the future leaders of the United States. I'd like to close as I did on that hot fall day 6 years ago by offering a quote. He lived in a world in which freedom of conscience and freedom of mind were battles still to be fought, not principles already accepted of all men. He loved peace and he loved liberty, yet he was forced to choose between them. We judge him by the application of his philosophy to the circumstances of his life. But in such applying, we come to understand that his life was given for those deeper values that persist throughout all time. These words, which I believe are so applicable to the life of FDR, were in actuality spoken by him as he stood just some yards from this very spot on April 13th, 1943, as he dedicated another magnificent memorial to Thomas Jefferson. And that is the message of this memorial. I welcome you to the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial and to all the messages it carries. And ladies and gentlemen, it now gives me great pleasure to introduce to you the Vice President of the United States.
Thank you very much, David, to you and to members of the Roosevelt family.
President and Mrs. Clinton, Your Royal Highness Princess Margaret, Secretary Babbitt, and all of the members of the Cabinet who are gathered here, to the Justices of the Supreme Court and the leaders and members of the House and Senate, to the co-chairs of this great commission, Senators Hatfield and Inouye, and the commissioners, Senator Levin and Phil English and Maurice Hinchey, and to the designers and sculptors and all who have labored so long and hard to bring our nation this magnificent memorial, to the distinguished guests on the dais, members of the diplomatic community, and other distinguished guests. I'm very grateful for the opportunity to say a brief word here, and frankly, I'm surprised, because I was telling a group yesterday about Franklin Roosevelt's first vice president, John Nance Garner, who had a unique communication strategy. Garner refused to make speeches. Maybe that's why Roosevelt liked him so much. But in keeping with that legacy, my remarks will be brief. There is a reason why Franklin Delano Roosevelt's term in office was the longest of any president in American history. When our nation was brought to its knees, first through a devastating depression and then through a terrible war, he lifted our nation. Though he could not stand unaided on his own legs, Americans and freedom-loving people throughout the world stood upon his shoulders. One of the many messages that will be conveyed by this memorial in this place, conveyed to every child who might suffer any disability brought here by his or her parents, is that the greatest president of this century, who led this nation as no other could, was disabled. His legacy and that of his wife Eleanor lives in every man and woman who followed him into public service, whatever their party, whatever their political philosophy. His compassion has been felt by Americans of every race and creed, every background, and in every part of the country. Not least, may I say, in the Tennessee Valley, which was lifted so high by Franklin Delano Roosevelt. My family is among the millions whose course was profoundly altered by President Roosevelt. I am in public service because my mother and my father, as young adults, heard Franklin Roosevelt's voice on the radio and were inspired by his voice and infused with his determination to help lift this country up. I'm part of the third generation of elected officials in public service primarily because of Franklin Delano Roosevelt. All my life, as I was being raised particularly, I've heard stories of what his words and what his determination meant to that generation of Americans, and the power continued down through history. His legacy will always endure. And this wonderful memorial will convey that legacy from now on in our nation's capital. He personifies America's determination to prevail, whatever the obstacles.
Please welcome the co-chair of the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial Commission, Senator Daniel Inouye.
President Clinton, Mrs. Clinton, Vice President Gore, Mrs. Gore, distinguished guests, and ladies and gentlemen. The people of this nation have waited 5 decades for this national memorial. The American people have waited 5 decades for this moment. At long last, this memorial will take its rightful place near the great national memorials of Washington, Jefferson, and Lincoln. All Americans feel a deep debt of gratitude to President Roosevelt for his leadership in our nation's struggle for peace, our well-being, and human dignity. All Americans enjoy more secure lives and a higher standard of living because of this great man. The expectations of how we live, work, and age stem from President Roosevelt's programs. The Civilian Conservation Corps helped restore America's forests and land resources. The National Rural Electric Cooperative gave farmers a decent life. The Federal Highway Program developed a national system upon which our automobile and trucking industries depend. The Works Progress Administration built schools and hospitals throughout this land. The GI Bill of Rights became one of the most far-sighted veterans programs in the history of mankind. And every American who receives a Social Security check owes a debt of gratitude to President Roosevelt. And so this day we come here together to celebrate and honor the vision, the complexity, and the leadership of a great man, and ponder the profound influence he has had on our lives. The Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial Commission was organized in 1955 for the purpose of considering and formulating plans for the design and construction of a permanent memorial to President Roosevelt. This memorial represents a plan and design that has undergone extensive review and study by the Commission of Fine Arts, the National Park Service, the Department of the Interior, and the Congress. After 23 years and 3 design competitions, the final design of the memorial was approved in 1978. I join others in commending Larry Halpern for his magnificent design of natural landscaping, of water, sculpture, and the inspiring words carved in granite walls depicting the momentous events of the Roosevelt era: the Great Depression, World War II, and the great social, economic, and cultural upheavals that took place during President Roosevelt's 12-year presidency. I also wish to compliment the 5 American artists whose sculptures and images enhance the 4 outdoor rooms, each representing one of President Roosevelt's terms in office. This memorial is built on a magnificent site that encompasses over 7.5 acres of West Potomac Park. The location is of major historic and symbolic significance. It is situated at one of the points designated for such a monument by the 1901 Macmillan Kite Plan, a master geometric design for monuments. Visitors moving through the memorial will be constantly aware of the Jefferson and Lincoln memorials and the Washington Monument, giving not only a profound experience of President Roosevelt and his great contributions to humanity, but also a deep sense of the historic continuity of this nation. All in all, this is a living memorial to the man and to the struggle and triumph America went through in those years. And so, Mr. President, and my fellow Americans, in the name of this commission, I have the great honor and the great privilege to deliver the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial into your keeping. Mr. President, This is our legacy, and we hope that America will love it. Ladies and gentlemen, I have the great honor and the high privilege to present to you the President of the United States of America.
Thank you very much. Thank you. Thank you very much. Senator Inouye, Senator Hatfield, Your Highness, my longtime friend David Roosevelt and the members of the Roosevelt family, Mr. Vice President, to all those who have worked to make this day a reality. Let me begin by saying to Senator Inouye and Senator Hatfield, the United States proudly accepts the Franklin Delano Roosevelt Memorial. Fittingly, this is the first occasion of its kind in more than 50 years. The last time the American people gathered near here was in 1943, when President Franklin Roosevelt dedicated the memorial to Thomas Jefferson. Today, we honor the greatest president of this great American century. As has been said, FDR actually wanted no memorial. For years, none seemed necessary, for two reasons. First, the America he built was a memorial all around us, from the Golden Gate Bridge to the Grand Coulee Dam, from Social Security to honest financial markets, from an America that has remained the world's indispensable nation to our shared conviction that all Americans must make our journey together. Roosevelt was all around us. Second, though many of us never lived under his leadership, many who did are still around. And we have all heard about him from our parents or grandparents. Some of us as we pass by WPA or CCC projects along country roads. Some of us as we looked at the old radios that our parents and grandparents kept and heard stories about the fireside chats and how the people felt. Today he is still very real to millions upon millions of Americans, inspiring us, urging us on. But the world turns and memories fade. And now, more than half century after he left us, it is right that we go a little beyond his stated wishes and dedicate this memorial as a tribute to Franklin Roosevelt, to Eleanor, and to the remarkable triumphs of their generation. President Roosevelt said, thank you. President Roosevelt said, "We have faith that future generations will know that here in the middle of the 20th century, there came a time when men of goodwill found a way to unite and produce and fight to destroy the forces of ignorance and intolerance and slavery and war." This memorial will be the embodiment of FDR's faith, for it will ensure that all future generations will know. It will ensure that they will all see the happy warrior keeping America's rendezvous with destiny. As we stand at the dawn of a bright new century, this memorial will encourage us, reminding us that whenever America acts with certainty of purpose and FDR's famous flexibility of mind, we have always been more than equal to whatever challenges we face. Winston Churchill said that President Roosevelt's life was one of the commanding events in human history. He came from privilege, but he understood the aspirations of farmers and factory workers and forgotten Americans. He electrified the farms and hollows, but even more important, he electrified the nation, instilling confidence with every tilt of his head and boom of his laugh. His was an open American spirit with a fine sense for the possible and a keen appreciation of the art of leadership. He was a master politician and a magnificent commander-in-chief. And his partner was also magnificent. Eleanor Roosevelt was his eyes and his ears, going places he could not go, to see things he would never see, to come back and tell him how things actually were. And her reports were formed as words in his speeches that touched little people all across America who could not imagine that the President of the United States knew how they lived and cared about them. She was his conscience and our nation's conscience. Franklin Roosevelt's mission was to change America to preserve its ancient virtues in the face of new and unprecedented challenges. That is, after all, America's mission in all times of change and difficulty. The depth and sweep of it was unprecedented when FDR asked a shaken nation to put its confidence in him. But he had no doubt of the outcome. Listen to what he said in September of 1932, shortly before he was elected for the first time. He proclaimed his faith, faith in America, faith in our tradition of personal responsibility, faith in our institutions, faith in ourselves, demand that we recognize the new terms of an old social contract. New conditions impose new requirements upon government and upon those who conduct government. That was his faith. He lived it, and we are here as a result. With that faith, he forged a strong and unapologetic government, determined to tame the savage cycles of boom and bust, able to meet the national challenges too big for families and individuals to meet on their own. And when he restored dignity to old age, when he helped millions to keep their farms or own their homes, when he provided the simple opportunity to go to work in the morning to millions, he was proving that the American dream was not a distant glimmer, but something every American could grasp. And then that faith of his infused all of his countrymen. With that faith, he inspired millions of ordinary Americans to take responsibility for one another, doing their part, in his words, through the National Recovery Administration, reclaiming nature through the Civilian Conservation Corps, gathering scrap, giving up nylons, and eventually storming the beaches at Normandy and Okinawa and Anzio. With that faith, he committed our nation to lead the world first as the arsenal of democracy, and then at the head of the Great Crusade to free the world from tyranny. Before the war began, the four freedoms set the foundation for the future and made it clear to the whole world that America's goal was not domination, but a dominion of freedom in a world at peace. With that faith, as the war neared an end he would never see, he traced the very architecture of our future, from the GI Bill to the United Nations. Faith in the extraordinary potential of ordinary people sparked not only our victory over war, depression, and doubt, but it began the opening of doors and the raising of sights for the dispossessed in America that has continued down to the present day. It was that faith in his own extraordinary potential that enabled him to guide his country from a wheelchair, and from that wheelchair and a few halting steps, leaning on his son's arms or those of trusted aides, he lifted a great people back to their feet and set America to march again toward its destiny. He said over and over again in different ways that we had only to fear fear itself. We did not have to be afraid of pain or adversity or failure, for all those could be overcome. He knew that, of course, because that is exactly what he did. And with his faith and the power of his example, we did conquer them all: depression, war, and doubt. Now, we see that faith again alive in America. We are grateful beyond measure for our own unprecedented prosperity. But we must remember the source of that faith. And again, let me say to Senator Inouye and others, by showing President Roosevelt as he was, we show the world that we have faith that in America, you are measured for what you are and what you have achieved, not for what you have lost. And we encourage all who face their difficulties and overcome them not to give in to fear, but to believe in their possibilities. And now again, we need the faith of Franklin Roosevelt in an entirely different time, but still no ordinary time. For in this time, new livelihoods demand new skills. We have to fight against the enormous destructive influences that still grip the lives of too many of our young people. We must struggle to make our rich racial, ethnic, and religious diversity a source of strength and unity when such differences are the undoing of millions and millions around the world. And we must fight against that nagging old doubt. It is a strange irony of our time that here at the moment of our greatest prosperity and progress in so many years, in 1932, 1 in 4 Americans was out of work. This morning we learned that fewer than 1 in 20 Americans are out of work for the first time in more than 2 decades. And at this time, where the pinnacle that Roosevelt hoped America would achieve in our influence and power has come to pass, we still strangely fight battles with doubts. Doubts that he would treat with great impatience and disdain. Doubts that lead some to urge us to pull back from the world at the very first time since Roosevelt's time, when we actually can realize his vision of world peace and world prosperity and the dominance of the ideals for which he gave his life. Let us honor his vision not only with this memorial today, but by acting in the way he would tell us to act if we were standing here giving this speech on his braces, looking at us and smiling at us and telling us we know what we have to do. We are Americans. We must have faith. We must not be afraid, and we must lead. The great legacy of Roosevelt is a vision and a challenge, not a set of specific programs, but a set of commitments. The duty we owe to ourselves, to one another, to our beloved nation, and increasingly to our fellow travelers on this small planet. Now we are surrounded by the monuments to the leaders who built our democracy. Washington, who launched our great experiment and created our republic. Jefferson, who enshrined forever our creed that it is self-evident
that we are all created equal with unalienable rights to life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Lincoln, who gave his life to preserve Mr. Washington's republic and to make real Mr. Jefferson's words. And now, Franklin Roosevelt, who saved freedom from tyranny, who restored our republic, who defined Mr. Jefferson's creed to include freedom from want and fear. Today, before the pantheon of our democracy, let us resolve to honor them all by shepherding their legacy into a new century, into a new millennium. Our mission is to prepare America for the time to come, to write a new chapter of our history, inspired always by the greatest source of hope in our history. Thomas Jefferson wrote the words, but Franklin Roosevelt lived them out every day. Today, I ask you to remember what he was writing at Warm Springs when he died. That last speech. The only limit to our realization of tomorrow will be our doubts of today. Let us move forward with strong and active faith. My fellow Americans, every time you think of Franklin Roosevelt, put aside your doubts. Become more American. Become more like him. Be infused with his strong and active faith. God bless you. God bless America. And may God always bless the memory of Franklin Delano Roosevelt.
And now to deliver the benediction, Rabbi Yechiel Eckstein.
Hine matov umanaim shevet achim gam yachad. How good and how pleasant it is for brethren to dwell together in unity. We come before you, O God, as a grateful nation on behalf of generations of Americans, past, present, and future, to forever remember our collective debt to Franklin Roosevelt. He brought us from the abyss of darkness, fear, and despair, and set our course firmly in the pursuit of justice, righteousness, and mercy. He taught us by his courageous example how to face adversity of every kind. He was and remains forever an inspiration, a model of the moral leader and public servant who cared deeply for all people and sought to bring dignity to their lives by fulfilling your call to do justly, love mercy, and walk humbly with you. We here today and freedom-loving people everywhere will forever have a special place in our hearts for President Roosevelt, for uniting and rallying the free world to challenge and ultimately triumph over the dark forces of evil, for plucking the Jewish remnants from the fires and ovens of destruction, for restoring our faith in man's ability to do good. We Americans and free people everywhere will forever be grateful for the legacy he leaves us, one for us all to remember and to emulate in our own lives. He was our leader, our hero, our special friend. May his memory continue to bless and inspire us today and for generations to come. Amen.
Thank you, Rabbi Eckstein. Ladies and gentlemen, we ask now that you please remain seated as President and Mrs. Clinton and other dais guests move to the memorial entrance for the ribbon cutting, which you'll be able to see on the large screens.